everybody. Welcome to This Week in Innovation. Today, Sandeep Mittal, co-founder of Solus.ai, joined Brian and I for a discussion on how AI can power hyper-personalized customer engagement. Solus was launched in mid-2019 and is now going global with both B2B and B2C case studies. AI is one of the 5 forces of innovation that Brian and I have been talking an awful lot about, and this is a subject we will really be focusing on over the next couple of years. Give it a listen and let us know what you think. I'm here with my podcast partner, Brian. How are you doing tonight?
Doing good, Jeff. How are you? Today is an interesting day because we had so much to do during the day, and we are recording this podcast late in the evening. I think summer is going away, so it's a bit dark outside here in California. And I also want to introduce this. Today we have a great startup and a founder here with us, but before I introduce them, I want to talk a little bit about one of the themes that we are going to be focusing today. The theme that we're going to be talking today is the AI theme. And within that AI, the AI force, because as you listeners, our whole podcast series is about the 5 forces of innovation, right? AI, IoT, blockchain, data, and startups. So within that force, today we are going to talk about the force of AI. Within that AI force, one of its use cases, and especially in retail, and it's for table stakes these days, which is recommendation and personalization. Because every shopper who is offline and online expects the brand or the retailer to know who they are and serve them exactly what they want at that given moment. So today, in that vein, we have a really awesome startup. We have its founder, Sandeep. The name of the startup is Solus.ai. And Sandeep, welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here with you.
Awesome, Sandeep. Thanks again for joining us. Just why don't you go ahead and introduce your company and also tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sandeep. I'm one of the co-founders of Solus.ai. We work in the personalization and how do you nudge customers to influence the behavior. That's really the space that we're working in. We build learning solutions. We're an AI ML company. And we've been operational for 2 years now with phenomenal traction.
So, Sandeep, what problem are you trying to solve?
So just the problem that we're trying to solve is something that we learned over many years of experience. I've been in this space, for over 15 years. And we discovered that for retailers in particular, when they want to do good personalization, there's a number of challenges. So we wanted to help them make the micro decisions for personalization, like what product, what offer, what time, what channel, what words, what images. We wanted to help them do that at the segment of one level for each individual customer, through a learning system, not a rules-based system, through something that always on optimized and had really good measurement and attribution built in. And getting all of this together and getting it right is complexity at scale. So that's what makes it hard to pull off. So that's really what we wanted to solve for.
That is super interesting, Sandeep. So I love the fact that you are framing this problem as a complexity at a scale problem, right? And this is a problem that retailers and brands have to rely on vendors and tech companies such as yourself to look at the holistic data they have. So especially I love the fact that you're looking at the n equals 1 because especially with AI, this n equal 1 is gaining a lot of traction and a lot of retailers are adapting this type of systems. But one of the challenges that I've seen in a lot of cases is that unlike other industry, retailers don't have access to a lot of data. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they just don't. How do you actually track a customer? How do you track a customer who has no data or no prior profile with the retailer, right? How do you do a cold start?
Brian, that's actually one of the most interesting problems to solve for in this kind of context. It's a completely ubiquitous problem. Everybody has this. Every retailer has close to about half to maybe 60% of the database, which consists of customers who've only ever shopped once. And that makes the recommendation problem pretty hard because the customer walks in, buys a blue shirt. That's not the whole life of the customer. That's not the only thing on which you can base your next recommendation. So what we've done to solve for that is come up with a fairly neat mechanism to pool data across data-rich customers and use data that we've got for data-rich customers to figure out what to do for the data-sparse customer. So we do that through a mechanism of something we call the customer genome. We build a genome internally within Solus for every customer. We then find lookalike or matching customers for every single customer. It's a fairly complex engineering problem to do that when you've got millions of customers. And hence, we basically fill in the gaps for a data sparse customer by looking at what similar data-rich customers seem to be interested in or purchasing.
That is super interesting. So this genome, this building of the genome is essentially how you're solving the data problem at scale, the personalization problem at scale.
Yeah, that's a big part of the secret sauce within, which is really building out the genome and using it to make recommendations.
So Sandeep, how do you know if you don't have, how does a retailer know if they don't have enough data?
So Jeff, I think the interesting part I think every retailer does know in many ways that they don't have too much data because, like I said, a whole lot of customers that maybe they download the app but never bought, or they bought once and never come back. And we've always found the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So for the customers where you don't have too much past behavior, what they've purchased, what they've browsed, what they've searched for, what they added to cart but never bought. If you don't have much data for half your base around these kinds of signals, you're not data rich. And hence you may have a great recommendation solution for that 7% of the customers where you have a lot of data. But for the rest of them, you need something that will work harder.
How do you take a customer that you have a rich set of data for and then use that for a customer that you don't? Is it by demographics? Is it by male, female, or whatever, gender, behaviors? How do you fill in that data? That sounds like a really tough problem.
Yeah. So we have about 128 such features, Jeff. It ranges from demographics. Unfortunately, most of the time, you don't have a lot of information on demographics. So it will use behaviors. What did you buy that first time? When did you buy it? Was it full price or was it on sale? What day of week was it? What location was it? What channel was it? So every possible behavioral indicator. Was it in response to a communication? And even while customers are silent, when they are not coming to us, they're sometimes leaving some signals for us, because a signal can be a very passive signal like, how long has it been since you last came? And in the intervening period, if you've sent your communications, have you been opening them? If you do open them, when do you open them? So they're signals and they're available. You just have to do a really good job of collecting them, putting them in one place and use them to find matching customers.
So Sandeep, this is very interesting. So collecting data, right? So collecting the signals. And I know the collecting the signals online is probably much easier by various tags and on the site and using JavaScript and pixels and everything. But how does this problem extend to offline? Because a lot of the purchases are done offline, especially for traditional retail. How do you see the offline merging with the online, and how does your personalization flow across that? How do you see that entire connection?
That's actually a great question, and something that every omni retailer needs to solve for this. Because offline has a wealth of information, and very often, if you're making recommendations purely on the back of what's happening online, it's partial. It's never going to be complete. But like I said, getting the offline data is not going to be straightforward. You need to rely on the starting point will be your POS system data, the bill data that you're getting from there. If there's a loyalty program, then you collect the loyalty ID and you use that to link. If you have a mechanism to capture an email address or a mobile number at the point of sale, then you use that. We have people where you have kiosks for capturing feedback data at the point of sale. You can use that as well. So it's basically every single scrap of information you can get from the offline channel, whether it be, loyalty, kiosk, inventory, feedback, all of them. It's never complete, but it's more than enough very often.
Very cool. Very cool. So that's actually, so this goes back to the fact, right? If you can collect data, just collect it and think about it later, what you want to do with it.
Yes.
Right. So all the data that they've collected in the past is going to be super useful now.
It is.
Very cool.
So Sandeep, is online data, is that almost always complete versus offline, or are there still holes in online data versus the problems you have with offline?
It is far more complete. It's not often treated quite in some way. So let me just elaborate on that. Very often what happens is, because there are a lot of signals that are being captured online, one tends to give them all equal importance, which is never really the case. So something that we do within Solus is we kind of grade signals to say a purchase, of course, is top of the tier. Something like a payment failure sits below that. The cart abandonment would sit below that. Add to wish list would be a little below that. Search would be below. Browse would be below. So you need to be able to grade these signals and use them well, because otherwise, if you're going to give a browse of a product and a cart abandonment of a product, the same kind of, you'll end up with not quite the right recommendations. But in terms of completeness, yes, it's more than enough information to make the right recommendation for a customer.
So Sandeep, like talking about the rules, like rules in terms of rules and grades of various things, and then machine learning systems using their intelligence to rip through all this data and creating the right set of recommendations. How do you actually see, because one of the challenges that we've seen in the past is when startups go into retailers, in the very early days of adoption, we saw that is that merchants always come and say, you know what, we had our rule-based systems. This ML is a black box. I can't configure it. And then there are cases when people ran tests with machine learning systems doing recommendations. There are times it bypassed merchants, but there are other times cases where machine learning systems fail. But as you are talking to your customers about, especially in a world where you have marketing teams and IT teams and you have merchants, what are you actually seeing in terms of how they are adapting this, especially the different groups, especially this whole concept of thinking about a rules versus system versus a machine learning based system versus a black box versus a white box type solution?
So Brad, our own theory behind all of this is you need to have expert systems and learning systems sitting side by side and coexisting. They need to play nice with each other. So yes, in retail, merchants would have a point of view on how to make recommendations, for example. So very often what we're having is if you have 6 slots or 6 properties in which recommendations could be populated on, there'll be some kind of mechanism where maybe the first, third, and the fifth are taken up by one system and the second, fourth, and sixth are taken up by another system. And then you A/B test them out and see what's working better. Our entire approach has been start with the expert system, take the rules if the brand has the rules, put a learning layer on top of them, and then go back to them and just say that these are your rules. What we've helped you with is figure out which ones are working better than the others. So that's how the two systems play nice with each other. You get rules from the expert system and you learn to figure out which ones to persist and continue with and which ones to retire.
Very interesting approach, Sandeep. I really like that model because in that case, it also removes the friction. You are essentially allowing the data to speak and the consumers to respond and A/B tests to determine what's really working. And then there is a more method and guardrails to all the machine learning. So there is it's heavily configurable using an expert mechanism.
Yeah. And if I could just elaborate a little more on that, Brian, one really basic principle that we try to follow is don't shut something down just because it didn't work well once. So we'd rather keep something on and running and allow the learning system to keep feeding it a little bit of weightage. And if context changes, if the market changes, if competition changes, if something new is happening in the product line, and that rule that we had suppressed starts to get traction, the learning system will pick it up again. So we try not to shut the door on something just because it didn't work well in one test, for example.
Wow. Now that is definitely an interesting point because a lot of times machine learning systems have a tendency to auto get feedback and shut things down quickly. But there are over time, some of the variables could actually kick back in because just like humans, if I get myself a vacation, I'm not going to go vacation for the next at least another couple of quarters. So you have to have that thing running in the low grade eventually to figure that out. So I can definitely see that. I think this is very, very applicable. This space, Sandeep, especially there's a lot of noise in this space, right? Because this is something a lot of retail leaders are trying to go after, right? Because recommendation is becoming table stake. Every customer, especially in the modern world of Amazon, you turn on your TV, the package shows up at your home, right? Netflix is super uber personalized, right? So every brand and every retailer, both online and offline, want to go this space. And then there is also lots of traditional larger software vendors trying to create noise in the space, as well as startup companies coming into this space constantly. How do you differentiate yourself? Because you're looking at the problems in different ways than what traditional players do. But tell us, describe to us how you are looking at the positioning, and how do you differentiate yourself in this space?
Yeah, so you're right, Brian. There is a lot of very interesting activity and a lot of people doing great stuff in this. The things that we feel we're doing differently that we talk about are a couple of things I've covered. One is really that 100% data coverage, that we will look beyond that online data stream. A lot of solutions strictly look at what's happening on the app or on the web. They don't consume offline data and a whole bunch of data sets which are very useful to us. So that 100% data coverage is something that we find resonates with a lot of omni-retail. The fact that we can deal with data sparsity, we can deal with that cold start problem, we can deal with that inactive customer who's not coming online, not even walking into the store, and hasn't been coming for the last couple of years. So that's something that's always of interest to people. Working at that n equal to 1, that segment of 1 level, working with a learning system that plays nice with an expert system is also interesting, but I'd say probably the top two are that 100% data coverage and the data sparsity problem.
Super interesting. Super interesting. The other thing I'm in here is tell us a little bit. End of the day, a lot of these systems, Sandeep, have to create conversion increases, have to average order value, because one of the things that's really good about these recommendation types AI systems is, unlike other applications or use cases of AI, you can easily measure the conversions and you can see if it's working and get feedback really quickly. Tell us a little bit about the benefits that you bought in terms of conversions, average order values, and so on in your implementations.
So, Brad, we've really put a lot of thought into the measurement framework. We actually have a 5-tier measurement framework, and it's something that honestly any enterprise should really look at how they do attribution and measurement. It's often not a very strong area in a bunch of places. For us, the bottom of the tier, in fact, is the analytical metric of your recommendation accuracy, because that's something that is super interesting to the data scientists. The business folks are sometimes interested, sometimes not. So, for example, we run typically at about 80 to 90% recommended accuracy, which really is your recall value of the recommendations you made versus what was actually picked up by customers who did a transaction. So that's one way we measure it. The second way we measure things is the nudge metric. So what's the impact on an open rate, on a click-through rate? Because eventually it does need to have an impact on engagement with customers. So email open rates, we've typically seen go up by about 80%. Click-through rates is crazy. We've seen anything from a 200 to 300% improvement in clicks with better personalization. So that's insane very often for the brand, where their 1.5% CTR jumps up to about 4 to 4.5%. That's just phenomenal for them. We then measure lift, and lift really is with every single action that the control group. So how do you measure that increment or that delta that the exposed group of who's seeing the recommendations or the personalization versus the others? Lift numbers, we typically improve by about 50 to 100%. That's been the average that we've seen. Above that, we measure business KPIs. So what's the repeat? What's the retention? What's the average basket size? What's the average bill value? Ultimately leading to ROI and percentage contribution to top line. Percentage contribution to top line is our North Star metric, and it's a really hard one to own because this is like an ultimate business metric, but we really embrace that. We say all the incremental sales that we're generating, we're going to report that as a percentage of top line. And the retailers where we're hitting 9% of top line. So that's significant for them. That's so non-trivial that we have the head of the business coming in on every meeting. So the 9% of top line is not to be sneezed at.
Wow. So, thank you for that coverage, and especially for all of our retail leaders who are listening to this. And some of you are pretty familiar with this type of a model, but it's very interesting to look at how structurally a framework that one can apply to something like this to continue to evaluate solutions in this space. So at this point, Sandeep, can you tell us a little bit about your customers and the sort of the traction you're getting, and then maybe even the customer names that you can mention or their profiles? That would be really...
So we've got a lot of traction in the Asian markets and some picking up in Europe as well. We just about started our GTM for the US market. So we're new in that market and we're looking to sign up a lot of business out there. But we've got some very good logos in the markets that we're active in. So in the India market, we probably have 3 out of the top 5 retailers who collectively have a coverage of about over 100 million customers. We've got brands such as Benetton, we've got brands like Puma, we've got like a Tommy Hilfiger, Marks and Spencer's, all brands that are using Solus. We've got traction in a lot of QSR brands, Pizza Hut and KFC, and other similar brands in European markets using Solus. We got one brand, I can't mention the name of which is probably one of the largest electronics giants in the world, also using Solus to help in personalization of outreach to their customers in Asian markets. We also have traction in other industries, and I mentioned that only because I think cross-pollination always helps. We've got securities companies, mutual funds, CPG companies, hospitality, hotels and travel. And that cross-pollination of how they approach the same problem and how they solve for it, I think really helps us in retail as well. So for example, a CPG company very often would look at not just recommending one product, but a basket of products. So building a recommender system that recommends a basket, a lot of which consists of replenishment of products you've already bought, is a twist to the problem that is actually applicable to a lot of retail. But CPG does that very well. So learning from there really helps us in how we would approach that for retail.
That's really interesting. I'm not sure I can think of a solution that can cut across so many different verticals, but it makes perfect sense because recommendations are recommendations, whether it's which bond do I buy or which stock do I buy or which pair of running sneakers do I buy. Interesting. Who are your buyers for the solution when you talk to it? And let's get back to just to focus on retail. So when you knock on a retail store, who are you targeting?
It's typically the CMO, Jeff. That's the main buyer that we're looking at and the person who we engage most often. In some cases, it would be somebody heading up a function like CRM or lifecycle management, or once in a while, it's just somebody who's got a title of head of personalization as well. But more often than not, it is the CMO.
Specifically, it probably starts with e-commerce first, right? Because they probably gravitate first into it, where they can put this on their site and then increase offline.
So, Brian, it's split between e-commerce where they want to improve on-site engagement and CRM that wants to improve the outreach.
Very interesting.
God,
okay,
I love hearing that. So the store's roaring back. I love that story. How long does it take to onboard a retailer?
It takes 4 weeks from getting the data to going live, and it takes another 4 weeks for them to see impact.
Now, typically when I talk to a software provider, there's always services wrapped around it. In this case, since we're really just at the start of the uptake around AI, is there more consulting wrapped around what you're doing? I hear you talk about training the AI model, machine learning. Is that part of the process? Is that built into the equation? Do retailers need new skills to take advantage of what you're doing?
That's a great question, Jeff. Because the area that we're in, AI in particular, it is not as low touch as a lot of other SaaS solutions. So yes, it does take tuning. It does take a little bit of understanding of the data model. It does take a little bit of setting up the measurement metrics. But we build that completely into the SaaS subscription. It's not a separate line item. Those the services are built in. And they're really there for the first 8 to 12 weeks. And after that, it reduces. But it's built in. And we don't expect the retailer to come in with these skill sets. We just need a point of contact who's helping out with decisions and nothing else. So it should not require them to learn new tools or a new language at all.
I'm always curious as I spend more time thinking about the impacts of AI in retail, what skills do retailers need to make sure they have in shop, though? I understand what you're saying, that your solution, you can manage that all. But are there new job descriptions that are evolving in that retailers need to be thinking about? Let's say out 3, 4, 5 years?
Sure. I think one job, which is not in 3, 4, 5, it's right here and now, is really about data tagging, data cleanup, creating the right kind of metadata, because retailers, especially the ones which are fairly deep product masters, very often your learning solutions are going to be as good as the product master that you have. And product masters very often are not in great shape. So creating metadata around your product, not just the descriptors like the fit and the size and the color, what is the kind of usage occasion for it? Is it like trendy or stoic? So that's an area where a fair amount of work can be generated. So around data capture as well, what's happening in store, how do you use video data? So I think those are the areas where we're probably seeing a lot of new kinds of job descriptions popping up.
Very interesting. For working in North America, I classify retailers in tiers. So tier 1, greater than $1 billion. Tier 2, $999 million to $250 million. Tier 3, $250 to $50 million. I don't have the equivalent for India, but for our North American, so apologies to our international listeners, but for North American listeners, what tiers do you typically work in using my standard?
So the current version of Solus is, I would say, for tier 1 and 2. We're looking in the roadmap at building out a light version that would essentially be a plugin and sit on top of any kind of e-commerce or e-commerce solution. But right now, tier 1 and 2 is where we're playing.
And also what would be interesting in this story is because the solution is very unique and it has been vetted by a lot of different brands and retailers, and it's been already in production. So based on what you are seeing, Sandeep, can you tell us a little bit about among the tier 1 and the tier 2 retailers, what sort of adoption, not just your solution, but in general, like recommendations and AI, what sort of adoption is happening or has already happened? And what do you think or what do you predict is going to happen, like from a percentage and a growth perspective? Where do you see it?
Brand, in the markets that we're operating in, the people that we're speaking with, the adoption is, I would say it's more in the range of perhaps about 7 in every 100 that have already adopted, 5 to 7 in every 100 that have adopted or are working through an existing solution. The next about 25 to 30% are actively looking at getting something on board. And the balance are people that either haven't considered it or are right now in acquisition mode and they're not really focusing on that retention and the next transaction as closely. But they're always interested when you show them a great solution. But that's the kind of split we've seen in terms of like the top 7% with adoption, the next 30% for an evaluation, and then the balance.
That is very interesting, Sandeep. Especially I love the opportunity of another 20-30% that is sitting out there who are currently in evaluation, and then maybe another 50-60% that could turn into customers. I think, Jeff, This is an interesting point because this also goes back to why AI is constantly being upgraded into the market sizes. Earlier, we saw that IDC and various outlets out there had at one point I saw a report at 170 billion market size, then went into 300 billion. Now it's a 500 billion market size, right? So that means the need is more and more uncovered, and then more and more players are actually beginning to adapt it, and the spend is becoming real because recommendation and vertical recommendation itself is becoming a stable state. But imagine if that itself is having so much of growth potential. Imagine every other subcategories on AI, the amount of growth they're going to have.
Brian, we're right in the middle, or not in the middle. We're just getting started and trying to understand the AI market, and these numbers are insane. They are literally insane.
And, I agree. And Sandeep, you're in a great space.
Sandeep, when you hear an analyst say almost faint by looking at numbers, that's probably a pretty good indication you're at an interesting space.
Yes.
We try to understand, are these numbers real? Yeah, I think they are. And I also always interested in when I hear adoption. So if we're talking about 7% of tier 1 retailers, you're barely breaking out of aggressive adopters of technology. And so obviously the whole bulk of the industry is laying in wait. So I think this is one of these solutions and one of these areas that we're not going to see a 15 or 20 year ramp up. I think we're going to really see a 5 or 6 or 7 year ramp up once these AI vendors begin to show value, and once the aggressive adopters show value. I think we're going to see a very rapid uptake.
The other thing I think, Jeff, is also that the need for recommendation and the need for personalization and is heavily driven by the customer, right? So like Sandeep said, the CMO is the main buyer because marketing organizations are constantly pushed and driven and challenged every day to know the customer better and better and better, right? Because this whole thing about everything about you is very well known. So every consumer expects you turn on the TV, you hop into your treadmill, you expect the treadmill to know how many calories you ran yesterday. But if the treadmill doesn't know, your Apple Watch knows, and your Apple Watch is going to tell your treadmill, right? So every part of your life is quantified, right? And measured, and there is in a world like that, there is a natural expectation from the consumer. Why should I give you all these numbers? It's funny because I think a couple of weeks ago I was in a customer support line, a very old, large traditional company, and then I went from one customer service person to another, I have to repeat everything again. And I was thinking to myself, I'd rather go online, because in online, the online system would actually know everything about me. But that's, I think, as a consumer, I think the expectations drastically changed. And I think it's all driven by the ecosystems of Amazon, Netflix, app, everything that you see around yourself, Google.
Right.
Facebook.
And Brandon, there's a very interesting play happening over there. These are the kind of shining beacons like a Netflix and Amazon, and everybody wants to get to what they're doing in some shape and form. But doing that is not easy. And what's happening is there's a whole bunch of brands which were traditionally never captured customer data. They're now going D2C. They're selling directly to consumers. They want to have a great experience for the consumers, but they're capturing customer data for the very first time. So there's a great opportunity there where they aspire to the Amazon level of personalization. They're tasting customer data for the very first time. That's that intersection at which solutions like the ones we're building are going to do really well.
Absolutely. That is definitely a very strong opportunity, right? Because you're right. Because especially in the last few years back with all the DTC brands, especially DTC online only pure play DTCs coming up, retailers are realizing, and Amazon going with the marketplace, DTC is the opportunity, and they're shifting towards that. But then, like you said, the personalization is not quite there, and they have to catch up really fast. And that creates a very strong need to move fast in the market, and also figure out methods to go through legacy data, clean it up, and also break the silos in data, and then bring everything back and figure out how everything connects together. It's a huge, major challenge, bigger, very large undertaking.
Well, Sandeep, as we wrap up, what do retailers, what would you tell, not the 7% that are already adopting, but the other 93% of retailers that are just beginning to either think about AI or not even there yet? What would you tell them they should be thinking about?
They basically have to think about a lot of always on experimentation. Don't assume anybody has the answers. No system, no person. Have a system that can keep experimenting for you. Learn from what works, and don't shut the door on what's not worked at this point of time. That's really the line of thought that is going to play out really well.
I love hearing the word experimentation. I can't emphasize that enough. That's unfortunately, we've been in an industry that's been very afraid to experiment. And if you can champion that, I will be your biggest fan in encouraging retailers to experiment early and often and fail and be comfortable in failing as long as you're learning from it. Sandeep, thanks for spending some time with us. We'll have all your contact information in the show notes. I look forward to hopefully someday bumping into you at a physical conference again. I'm not sure when that's going to be, but hopefully it'll be soon.
When humans begin to meet back again. Yeah. And wonderful advice, Sandeep. I think there's your thoughts, especially the final parting thoughts, I think is very valuable to retailers and brands, especially keep experimenting, and also don't shut down the things that don't work, but learn from them, keep them going at a smaller level, or continue to learn from them. And I think that's a very, very powerful message. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot, Brian and Jeff. This was an absolute blast. It was great fun being on here with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode. For more info, refer to the pod notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us grow. I'm your host, Jeff Roster, analyst at large. If you want to connect, follow us on Twitter at JeffPR or at Brian Sathianathan, or connect with us on LinkedIn. Visit my website at roster.retail.com or Brian's at Iterate.ai. Until next time, stay safe and have a great week.